thought I had already lost. I could see it in the way my son-in-law leaned back in his chair at the conference table, arms crossed, a small smile at the corner of his mouth. Like a man who had already spent the money. My daughter sat beside him, not looking at me. She hadn't looked at me directly in almost 2 years. I was 63 years old, sitting across from 2 lawyers I hadn't hired, in a room that used to feel familiar. The building was on Meridian Avenue, 3 blocks from the hardware store where I'd worked for 31 years. I knew every crack in the sidewalk outside, and still somehow I felt like a stranger in my own life. Let me back up, because none of this started at that conference table. It started the night my wife, Audrey, passed away. We were married for 38 years. I want to say that slowly so it lands right. 38 years. We had a daughter, Simone, who was born when Audrey was 26 and I was 25, in a hospital in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the middle of a November thunderstorm. I remember the sound of the rain on the window. I remember the nurse handing her to me and thinking, this is the whole thing. This is what it's all for. Audrey was a bookkeeper for a dental practice. I managed the floor at Hartwell's Hardware. We weren't rich people. We were careful people. Every 2 weeks, a portion of my paycheck went into a savings account. Every Christmas bonus, half went into a CD at the credit union when Audrey's mother passed and left her a small inheritance. $42,000. Audrey cried for a week, then put all of it into a money market account she said was for when we're old and need it. We paid off the house on Creekside Drive in 2019. No mortgage. No car payments by that point. We had about $340,000 in savings and retirement accounts between us, a house worth maybe $280,000 depending on the market, and a piece of land outside of Maryville that her father had left her. 11 acres, mostly wooded, appraised around $95,000. Not a fortune, but a life's worth of quiet, stubborn work. Audrey was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2021. She was gone 14 months later. I don't need to describe what that year was like. If you've ever watched someone you love disappear a little at a time, you already know. And if you haven't, there are no words that do it justice anyway. What I will tell you is that in the last weeks of Audrey's life, our daughter was there. She drove up from Atlanta, where she lived with her husband Vince, and she sat by her mother's bedside, and she cried real tears. And I thought, whatever distance has grown between us, whatever awkwardness, this has closed it. This grief is going to bring us back to each other. I was wrong about that. Vince had been in Simone's life for about 6 years by then. I want to be fair. I want to say that carefully. There are men you dislike for no reason you can name. And then there are men who give you reasons. And I spent a long time telling myself I was in the first category when I was actually in the second. He sold commercial real estate. He was good at it. He had a way of talking about money that made it sound like he was doing you a favor by explaining it to you. Like financial literacy was something he was generously sharing rather than using to make himself feel superior. The first Thanksgiving he joined us, he spent 20 minutes explaining why our savings were underperforming and how we should be in index funds. Audrey thanked him politely. After he left, she looked at me across the kitchen and said very quietly, "I don't trust that boy." I told her she was being unfair. I believed what I said. After Audrey died, I was in bad shape. That is just the truth. I stopped eating regular meals. I lost 11 pounds in 6 weeks. I sat in the house on Creekside Drive and stared at rooms that still smelled like her and couldn't remember what I was supposed to do with a day. Simone called more than she had in years. She checked in. She suggested I come stay with him in Atlanta for a while. She said it would be good for me not to be alone. I said yes. That was in September of 2022. I drove down in my truck with a bag and the dog, a 12-year-old beagle named Henry, and I stayed in their guest room for what was supposed to be 6 weeks. I stayed for 4 months. During that time, Vince started asking me questions. Not intrusive at first. Practical things. Had I updated the beneficiary designations on my retirement account since Audrey passed? Had I thought about whether the house was set up correctly for when I eventually, his word, transitioned? He offered to help me get everything organized. He said it like a kindness. He said it like a kindness. He said it like someone who spent his days thinking about property and paperwork and just wanted to apply that expertise to help his father-in-law through a hard time. I was grieving. I was tired. I said yes to things I shouldn't have said yes to. I signed documents that Vince put in front of me. I want to be honest about that. He explained them in general terms, said they were standard estate planning forms, said they would help streamline things, said he had a friend who was an estate attorney and had reviewed them. I read what I could. I didn't understand all of it, and I signed. One of those documents, I later learned, was a durable power of attorney granting Vince control over my financial affairs. Another was an amendment to the title on the Maryville property. A third, and this is the one that kept me up at night for months after I finally understood what had happened, was a document that redirected the beneficiary on one of my larger retirement accounts, an IRA worth about $187,000, away from the trust Audrey and I had set up years earlier, and listed a new primary beneficiary, an LLC that Vince had registered in Georgia 6 months before Audrey died. I didn't know any of this for a long time. What woke me up was a letter. I had moved back to Knoxville by the spring of 2023. Something in me needed the house on Creekside Drive, needed the familiar weight of my own furniture and the maple tree in the backyard that Audrey had planted the year Simone started kindergarten. Henry died that February, peacefully, in his sleep, on his bed beside the radiator, and I think losing him made me want what was familiar even more. The letter came from my credit union in April. It was a notice about a change in account ownership structure on a joint savings account that Audrey and I had held. The account had been moved, or technically retitled, to a name I didn't recognize. When I called the credit union, they told me the change had been authorized with a power of attorney document that I had apparently signed. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that phone call. I am not a man who panics easily. I spent 31 years managing a hardware floor, which means I spent 31 years solving problems with whatever I had on hand. You learn to slow down when things go wrong. You learn to look at what's actually in front of you before you start swinging. So I started making phone calls. Quietly, I called my own estate attorney, a woman named Patricia who had helped Audrey and me set up our trust years before. I told her what I knew. She went quiet for a moment, then said, "Bring me everything." I brought her everything. It took Patricia and her associate 6 weeks to untangle what had happened. When they laid it out for me, I sat in her office and didn't say anything for almost 2 minutes. The power of attorney had been used to retitle the savings account. The Maryville property had been transferred into an LLC. The IRA beneficiary change had been submitted electronically using credentials I had apparently authorized at some point during those 4 months in Atlanta. "Can this be undone?" I asked. Patricia said, "Some of it. But we have to move carefully." Here's what she told me next, and this is important. A direct legal challenge would be slow, expensive, and uncertain. Vince had structured things in a way that, on paper, looked like I had consented to everything. A sympathetic judge might see through it, or might not. What Patricia said we needed was evidence. Documented, undeniable evidence that this was not estate planning done on my behalf, but a calculated effort to transfer my assets to someone else's control. She referred me to a man named Garrett, a private investigator out of Nashville, who specialized in financial fraud cases involving older adults. He was quiet and methodical, and cost more per hour than I wanted to think about. But he had done this before. Over the next several months, Garrett documented a pattern. Phone records showing Vince had contacted the credit union on my behalf without my knowledge on 3 separate occasions. An email chain obtained through a civil subpoena in which Vince corresponded with the Georgia LLC's registered agent about the timeline for completing the transfer. A recording. Legal in Tennessee, where only one party needs to consent. From a phone call in which Vince spoke to a colleague about the Maryville property as if it were already his, describing it as the land deal and estimating its value once it was fully cleared. I listened to that recording in Patricia's office. Vince's voice was calm and businesslike, explaining to someone that his father-in-law was not really engaged and that the process was basically on autopilot. I had helped that man put up a fence in his backyard. I had driven 6 hours to be there when their first daughter was born. I had sent birthday cards to his mother every year because Audrey said it was the right thing to do, and I trusted her judgment on what was right. I did not say anything when the recording ended. I just told Patricia, "Tell me what we do next." Vince filed the civil action in the spring of 2024. It was a preemptive move, Patricia told me. He was trying to establish legal standing over the LLC assets before I could challenge the transfers. He and Simone had by then figured out that I was asking questions. Simone had called me twice during the winter. The conversations were strange, careful, like she was trying to gauge what I knew without asking directly. I kept my voice even. I said I was fine. I said I was just getting my paperwork in order. I didn't tell her what I knew. I don't know, even now, how much Simone understood about what Vince was doing. That is the question I carry with me. I go back and forth on it. There are days I believe she was as manipulated as I was, that she knew he was helping with paperwork but didn't know the extent. There are other days when I remember the way she avoided looking at me at her mother's bedside. And I wonder. I appeared at the hearing alone, not without representation. Patricia was there, at the plaintiff's table. But I mean, I appeared as a man without his family, without his wife, without his daughter, a 63-year-old man in a gray jacket who had driven himself downtown and found a parking spot 2 blocks from the courthouse and walked in carrying a folder and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Vince was there with 2 attorneys. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He had a leather portfolio on the table in front of him. When I walked in, he glanced at me and then looked away, the way you look away from something that doesn't concern you. Simone was sitting behind him in the gallery. She was looking at her phone when I came in. I took my seat. I put my cold coffee on the table. I folded my hands. One of Vince's attorneys opened with a presentation about the LLC and the legitimate estate planning purposes it served. He used a lot of words. He talked about asset protection and tax efficiency and the voluntary nature of the transfers. He mentioned, more than once, that everything had been signed by me, of my own will, witnessed appropriately. He was persuasive. I will give him that. Then Patricia stood up. She submitted the phone records. She submitted the email chain. She submitted the recording. The judge, a woman in her late 50s who had said almost nothing during the opening, put her pen down when she heard Vince's voice on the recording. She listened to the whole thing. Then she asked one of Vince's attorneys a question about the timeline of the LLC's formation relative to Audrey's diagnosis. The attorney said he'd need a moment to check. The judge said she could wait. What happened in that courtroom in the next 40 minutes is something I've gone over many times in my mind. Not because it was dramatic. It actually wasn't. Not in the way you might picture. But because it was the first time in almost 2 years that I felt like the ground was solid under my feet. The judge did not yell. She did not make a speech. She simply worked through the evidence with the same quiet precision that Patricia had used to build it. She asked questions that Vince's attorneys had no good answers to. She noted that the LLC had been registered 6 months before Audrey's death, which predated any legitimate estate planning conversation I could have had. She noted that the beneficiary change on the IRA had been submitted on a day when I had a documented medical appointment across town. She noted that the power of attorney I had signed did not, in fact, authorize the specific type of account retitling that had taken place. Vince was very still through all of this. The confident lean was gone. He sat straight in his chair and stared at the table. At one point, the judge paused and looked directly at him, not at his attorneys, at him, and said, "Mr. Vince, are you prepared to explain the discrepancy in these dates?" He said he'd defer to his counsel. She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, then looked back at the documents in front of her. The court issued a judgment voiding the power of attorney, ordering the retransfer of the savings account and the Maryville property back to my sole ownership, and referring the IRA beneficiary change to the State Attorney General's office for review as potential elder financial fraud. That referral, Patricia told me, had real teeth. It meant that a criminal investigation was now possible, separate from anything I had initiated. The LLC was dissolved. The total value of assets that had been moved without my legitimate consent came to approximately $298,000, including the land. I walked out of that courthouse alone, the same way I had walked in. But the cold coffee was still on the table and I didn't need it anymore. I drove back to Creekside Drive. The maple tree in the backyard was just starting to come in. Late April, the leaves still small and that specific bright green that they only are for about 2 weeks each spring, before they darken. Audrey used to watch that tree from the kitchen window. She said it was her calendar. She said when it turned that particular green, she knew winter was actually over. Simone called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was actually hot, and I looked at the backyard, and I thought about Audrey. And I thought about the 11 acres outside of Maryville that she had inherited from her father and that I had come very close to losing because I was too sad and too tired and too trusting to read the fine print. The voicemail was long. I listened to it once, then set the phone face down on the table. There are things I still don't know. Whether charges will be filed, whether Simone knew, whether any of this can be repaired, or whether the word repair is even the right one to use for something that may be too far gone. What I know is this: I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years on my feet in a hardware store, learning that things break, that you fix what you can with what you have, and that some repairs hold and some don't, and you have to be honest with yourself about which is which. I know that patience is not weakness, that being quiet while you work is not the same as accepting what's being done to you, that the people who assume you've already lost are sometimes the ones who've already made their biggest mistake. Audrey's maple tree is green again, and this house is still mine. I keep coming back to something Patricia said to me early on when I first laid everything out on her desk. She looked at the documents for a long moment and then said, "The people who do this kind of thing are counting on you to feel too ashamed to fight back." I didn't say anything then, but I've thought about it almost every day since. There's a version of this story where I never make those phone calls, where I stay in that guest room in Atlanta long enough to stop asking questions, where I tell myself that Vince's family, that family doesn't do this, that I must have misunderstood something. I know that version of myself. I was close to being him. Grief does that. It makes you want to hand the hard things to someone else just for a little while. And there are people in this world who watch for exactly that moment. What I've learned, not from a book, not from a sermon, but from sitting at my own kitchen table trying to figure out what happened to my life, is that doing the right thing and being smart about it are not two separate skills. They work together, or they don't work at all. I trusted Vince because I thought trust was the decent thing to do. But real decency includes paying attention. It includes reading what you sign. It includes asking the second and third question even when the first answer sounds reasonable. Audrey used to say she didn't trust that boy. She was exercising a kind of wisdom I had dismissed as instinct. It was more than instinct. It was her paying attention when I had stopped. And then there's the matter of getting back up. I want to be honest, there were weeks during all of this when I genuinely did not know if I had the energy to keep going. I was 63, I was alone, I had lost Audrey, I had lost Henry, and now I was looking at documents that told me I might lose the house on Creekside Drive and the 11 acres her father had left her. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing you've been wronged by someone you fed at your own table. It sits in your chest like a stone. But I got up. I made the calls. I drove to Patricia's office. I sat across from Garrett and answered every question he asked, and then asked some of my own. Not because I was certain it would work, because doing nothing was its own kind of choice, and I wasn't willing to make it. The outcome was fair. I want to say that plainly, without dressing it up. The court saw what happened and called it what it was. Vince's careful paperwork couldn't survive contact with the truth because the truth had its own paper trail, one he hadn't thought to account for. That's how these things tend to go, in my experience. Not always, not fast. But the people who build their plans on someone else's weakness usually underestimate how long that person can hold out once they decide to stand up. Audrey's maple tree is green again. That's enough for today.